The Spooky September Séance, a Miss Marple Mystery. Chapter 1. The soft September mist clung to the hedgerows and gently sloped fields surrounding the village of Little Skelton, as if it were the trailing edge of a wedding veil. It was one of those mornings that promised both warmth and hidden truths. The air was cool, the leaves beginning their slow transition to gold, and the village gossip, as ever, was a mere breath away from scandal. At the edge of the village stood Fern Hollow, an ivy-clad Georgian house which had seen better days but still retained a certain theatrical allure. Its new occupant, Mrs. Portia Welburn, had only arrived a fortnight ago but had already stirred the village as if she were stirring tea in a silent cup. Dressed in a parade of flamboyant silks and frequently speaking of vibrations, spirits, and energies, she had boldly declared herself a spiritualist of the sensitive sort. Even more provocatively, she had announced plans to host a séance on the evening of the equinox. The invitation, written in looping violet script on thick lavender paper and delivered by hand to select recipients, had caused a stir. Some had laughed, others had bristled, but nearly everyone agreed it would be fascinating. "Well, it's not really the kind of thing one does, is it?" murmured Mrs. Lavinia Crewe, pouring tea for her bridge group. "But I suppose in these modern times," she trailed off delicately, her eyes flicking to the invitation resting just beneath the silver toast rack. Miss Marple, sitting quietly beside the aspidistra, said nothing. Her expression remained politely neutral, the look she wore when paying very close attention. Miss Marple had not been included on the original guest list. However, she had still received an invitation, slipped beneath her door one morning. Without a note, an explanation, or a word, but with a faint scent of sandalwood. She had smiled to herself as she folded the paper in half. That evening, just as the sky began to take on a pale lavender hue, the guests began to arrive at Fern Hollow. Portia Welburn greeted them in a flowing gown of midnight blue, a circlet of silver leaves at her temple. Her maid, a sharp-eyed girl named Elise, ushered the guests into the drawing room, where chairs had been arranged in a circle around a table draped in black velvet. "There are 9 of us," said Reverend Giles Bartram, glancing around the circle. His tone was dry, a most unholy number. Portia laughed softly. "9 is sacred in some traditions, Reverend." Miss Marple, seated beside him, folded her hands in her lap and observed the room. The dim light of flickering candles danced across the faces of the guests. She noted Mrs. Lavinia Crowthorne looking particularly tense. Harold Greaves, a retired military man with a drinker's nose and a thundercloud temperament. Beatrice Fletton, young, nervous, and clutching her mother's brooch too tightly. Lionel Kent, the solicitor. And Mrs. Emmeline Sneed, widow of the late Cornelius Sneed, a tyrant of sorts in the village before his sudden heart failure last spring. The circle was completed by Martin and Dorothea Crane, a couple who had returned to the village after years abroad. Their accents were oddly flattened by foreign lands. Martin was tanned and restless, while Dorothea was pale and unreadable. "I ask that you open your hearts," Portia intoned, lowering herself into her chair with her hands held palms up. "For tonight, we reach across the veil into the great unknown." Miss Marple did not attempt to reach across any veil. She sat quietly, her eyes observing not Portia, but the others, how they looked at one another, whose gaze, the twitch of a mouth, the stiffness in a spine. Portia's voice dropped, grew deeper, and seemed to still. "I am seeing." A garden gate rusted, a child crying on the other side. Her eyelids fluttered. "There's something buried. Someone?" A woman, her name was suddenly a crash. Beatrice Fletton had dropped her glass. It shattered on the floor, the sound echoing in the charged silence. I'm sorry," she whispered. "I felt cold, like someone walked over my grave." Miss Marple did not glance at the broken glass. She focused on Beatrice's knuckles, white with pressure, and on Harold Greaves's sudden fixation on the fireplace. Dorothea Crane had pressed her hand over her mouth. Whether out of fear or to hide something else, Miss Marple could not yet determine. Portia opened her eyes slowly. "The spirits are unsettled tonight." The séance ended not long after, the atmosphere tense and brittle. Tea was served in the conservatory. Some guests made strained conversation while others left. Early, Beatrice was among the first to go, her shawl draped carelessly over her arm. Miss Marple lingered by a side table, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. She watched Elise collect the empty teacups and carry them to the kitchen. She noticed Portia watching Elise with faint distaste, and she observed the slight tremor in Emmeline Sneed's hand as she reached for a biscuit. It wasn't until morning that the village awoke to the full scandal. Portia Welburn was found dead in her bedroom. It was not in dramatic disarray, no broken furniture, no sign of forced entry. Her body lay curled beneath a paisley coverlet. Her eyes closed, an empty glass at her bedside. A half-melted candle still flickered on the dresser. The doctor declared it heart failure. Miss Marple, after a long walk through the damp lanes and a few thoughtful stitches of her embroidery, was certain it was murder. Chapter 2. By the time the church bell struck 9 on the morning after the séance, Little Skelton was already alive with whispers. It began, as these things often do, in the bakery queue where Mrs. Tilling, Mrs. Harrove remarked almost as an afterthought that she had seen the constable bicycling up to Fern Hollow before breakfast. That alone was enough to make Mrs. Tilling forget her currant loaf and lean forward, her eyes wide. Before breakfast, she gasped, "But surely that can't be routine. No one's ever in a hurry for Fern Hollow, not even the milkman," she said. "Unless, the vicar's housekeeper added, with the heavy dramatic flair of a stage actress. Something dreadful happened during that spirit-summoning nonsense. That was all it took. By mid-morning, 3 versions of Portia Welburn's death had made their rounds. One spoke of a ghostly possession, another suggested poisoning by candle wax, and the third, perhaps the most popular, claimed she'd been cursed by an Egyptian relic. Miss Marple, who gleaned her news less from gossip and more from observing the effects of gossip on others, listened politely as Mrs. Lavinia Crofton arrived on her doorstep, trembling with a sense of tragedy that barely masked her excitement. "Of all the ridiculous fads," Lavinia muttered, accepting tea without thanks. "Seances, incense, talking to shadows. That woman was meddling in things no decent Christian should even consider." "She did seem rather fond of theatrics, Miss." Marple agreed mildly. Lavinia nodded vigorously, then hesitated. "Still, she didn't look ill, did she? I mean, you saw her last night. There was nothing to suggest a weak heart." "I'm no medical expert," Miss Marple replied, brushing a crumb from the saucer. She poured her own tea steadily enough, her eyes sharp when not theatrically closed. Lavinia sighed. "The doctor's calling it heart failure. Poor man must be trying to avoid scandal." Miss Marple said nothing. She simply refilled the teapot and glanced toward the road. Elise, Portia's maid, was being led into the vicarage by Reverend Bartram. Her head was bowed, her dark braid limped down her back. From that distance, she looked younger than she had the night before, frightened too. By noon, Harold Greaves had been heard in the Fox and Willow, loudly proclaiming that seances were foreign foolishness and that he'd warned everyone there would be trouble. Meanwhile, Mrs. Emmeline Sneed refused to leave her house at all. "I heard she fainted when she heard," whispered Millicent Carroll, who claimed to have walked past the Sneed residence at precisely the right moment. Dorothea Crane, however, had been seen walking to the post office with unnerving composure. She posted a letter, exchanged polite words with Mr. Quibble the stationer, and declined an offer for tea from Mrs. Winterfred Trott. This, in Little Skelton, was considered a silent declaration of guilt or grief, or possibly both. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took her shawl and ventured out to the greengrocer's. She asked for plums and received pears, which she did not correct. She was more interested in observing who was speaking to whom and who wasn't. Lionel Kent, the solicitor, stood outside his office with his briefcase in hand, staring blankly at the brass plaque, as if it had suddenly begun speaking Latin. His wife, a famously sharp woman with no taste for scandal, had arrived unexpectedly from Bath that morning. The timing, Miss Marple noted, was curious. It was also curious that Elise had not returned to Fern Hollow. At 4 o'clock, the constable made his second appearance of the day, this time accompanied by Inspector Welch from the nearby town of Heathmere. A stout man with a red-checkered face and a voice that made shutters tremble. Welch was not known for subtlety. By supper time, it was widely known that Mrs. Welburn's cause of death was no longer considered natural. She was murdered, then? Lavinia asked, gasping, returning for another round of tea. I wouldn't know, Miss Marple replied, delicately lifting a biscuit. But I do know the doctor's signed certificate has been withdrawn. That's rather telling, don't you think? Lavinia's fingers trembled. And Elise? Do you suppose she be blamed? She was present, Miss Marple said simply, but so were many others, including ourselves. At that moment, a sharp knock interrupted the quiet of the cottage. When Miss Marple opened the door, she found young Constable Sims looking sheepish. Sorry to bother you, Miss Marple, he said, tugging his cap. Inspector Welch wonders if you'd be willing to speak to him. Of course, she replied without hesitation. Would you like a biscuit before we go? They're oat and ginger, very good for the nerves. He blinked. Thank you, ma'am, but I think we best be quick. Inspector Welch was waiting at the vicarage, having taken over Reverend Bartram's study as a temporary command post. Papers and photographs were already scattered across the once tidy desk, much to the vicar's quiet distress. Ah, said Welch, rising with surprising grace for a man of his bulk. Do come in. We're hoping you might assist. Not officially, of course. Just an extra pair of eyes. How kind, said Miss Marple, settling into the armchair nearest the fireplace. I suppose you've spoken with everyone present at the séance? We've started, Welch replied. There's a bit of confusion, different recollections. Elise, for instance, swears she saw Miss Welburn drink from her own glass and take a powder beforehand. Valerian root, apparently, but others deny seeing. That, Mrs. Sneed said nothing of powders, Miss Marple noted, accepting a cup of tea from the vicar. She also claims the candles flickered violently when the name Marianne was spoken. Who's Marianne? Asked Sims, still lingering in the doorway. Welch grunted. That's the question, isn't it? There's no record of a Marianne connected to Welburn. Could be a ruse. Could be nothing. Or, said Miss Marple gently, it could be that someone in that room did know a Marianne and reacted to the name being spoken aloud. Welch raised a brow. You're suggesting someone reacted emotionally and gave themselves away? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said, that the room grew colder, not because of the spirits, but because someone present suddenly remembered what they'd tried very hard to forget. Welch was silent for a moment, then leaned back. Right, then I suppose we'll need to look into the Cranes' past. They were abroad too long for my liking. And perhaps, Miss Marple added, you should ask Elise where Mrs. Welburn purchased her valerian powder. It may not have been valerian at all. As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple paused by the garden gate. A rusted hinge squeaked softly as she opened it, a faint echo of Portia's spectral vision the night before. A garden gate, she murmured half to herself. A child crying, and someone buried, but who? She walked home slowly, the shadows lengthening behind her. The village still buzzed, but not with certainty, only with unease. Chapter 3. The following morning dawned crisp and pale, with a sky the color of skimmed milk and a faint tang of smoke drifting from the chimneys of Little Skelton. It was the sort of day where everything seemed unnervingly quiet. Too quiet. Miss Marple thought as she passed the churchyard on her way to the grocer's. She wasn't doing any real shopping. Of course, just 2 eggs and a small loaf, purchased, more for show than necessity. Her true purpose was to walk, to observe, and most importantly, to listen. At the counter, she waited patiently behind Mrs. Hargrave, who was engaged in a loud dispute with Mr. Quibble over whether the tomatoes had been stored properly. Behind them, Dorothea Crane stood silently, holding a single lemon and avoiding eye contact with anyone. Miss Marple's eyes briefly flicked to Dorothea's shoes. Brown suede, well kept, but the sole of the right one was damp, darkened from water that hadn't come from the village roads. The puddles there had long since dried. Lemon drizzle? Miss Marple asked pleasantly. Dorothea startled, blinking. Oh yes, something like that. Such a comforting cake, Miss Marple murmured, though it never keeps well unless it's been wrapped in waxed paper. Dorothea gave a tight smile, nodded, and left without purchasing anything else. Miss Marple watched her go, then turned her attention back to the others. The mood had shifted from speculation to defensiveness. Everyone was saying less, not more. That, in Miss Marple's view, was when the truth began to seep through. She encountered Reverend Bartram near the war memorial. He was speaking with Lionel Kent, who appeared agitated. "You must understand," Kent was saying. "Mrs. Welburn came to me last week about amending her will. I told her it could wait until the following Monday. I never expected." "Well, did she say what sort of amendment?" Miss Marple asked gently, inserting herself into the conversation with the practiced subtlety of someone who had spent years doing so. Kent hesitated. She intended to remove a beneficiary. She didn't say whom. Miss Marple gave a polite nod. "That can cause all sorts of ruffled feathers." He looked away. "Not that anyone knew?" "She was quite secretive," Reverend Bartram coughed delicately. "She also hinted to me that she had received a threat, an anonymous letter, though she wouldn't let me see it." Kent snorted. "She was dramatic. All that Séance nonsense. Honestly, the whole thing reeked of performance. I wouldn't be surprised if she invented the threat just to create an atmosphere. Or," Miss Marple said softly, "to test someone." She left them with a gentle farewell and turned toward the green. Something was beginning to itch at her thoughts, a pattern half seen, as when embroidery stitches show faintly through muslin. At the far side of the green she found Elise. The girl sat beneath the lichen-covered sundial, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze fixed on a beetle crawling across the stone. "You haven't returned to Fern Hollow?" Miss Marple asked, settling beside her. "No," Elise murmured. "They said I could stay with the Cranes for now. I can't sleep in that house again, not after seeing her." Miss Marple waited, her silence prompting Elise to continue. "She didn't look scared," Elise said suddenly. "That's the strange part. People spoke as if it was something dreadful, but her face she looked calm, like she'd expected it. Expected to die, to be taken, or to slip away, I don't know." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the beetle, now climbing a blade of grass. "Was she in the habit of taking valerian sometimes?" Miss Marple asked. She claimed it helped her sleep. Elise sighed. "But she always added honey, said it tasted foul without it." "Did she take it the night of the séance?" Elise hesitated. She poured it herself from the little green bottle. "But," her voice dropped. "The bottle vanished afterward. I know where she kept it, and it's not there now." Miss Marple's fingers paused in their slow folding of her handkerchief. "And did she usually measure it?" "Yes, 1 spoonful, always the same. But this time, I didn't see her use the spoon." Miss Marple gave her a kind look. "Thank you, Elise. That may be more useful than you know." As she walked back toward her cottage, Miss Marple's thoughts wandered, not to poisons, but to people. People and the lies they told when they were frightened. She had been at that séance. She had seen Harold Greaves nearly spill his brandy when Portia mentioned a name Marianne. She had seen Beatrice Fletton drop her glass, and she had noticed Lionel Kent's sudden interest in the floorboards when the candle flickered violently. Then there was Emmeline Sneed. Her hand had trembled when she reached for her biscuit, but Miss Marple suspected it was not because of ghosts. Back at home, she retrieved her knitting and let her fingers work automatically, her mind drifting. Who was Marianne? That name had been spoken just once. Portia had said it softly, as if it had come to her unbidden, and in that moment, the room had shifted, not physically, of course, but emotionally. A sharp intake of breath, a sudden stiffness, silence. She laid her knitting aside and opened her bureau. At the bottom was a slim, leather-bound notebook in which she kept her social observations. Not a diary, certainly not a journal, just impressions, fragments, things people said, and the way they said them. She turned to the most recent entry. The séance, underlined in blue ink. Beneath the list of attendees, she made a small addition. Name spoken, Marianne. Reactions multiple. Greaves startled. Fletton dropped glass. Sneed went pale. Kent silent. Dorothea Crane unreadable. At least I'm familiar with the name. Then underneath, in smaller script, who is afraid of Marianne and why? That afternoon, Miss Marple called on Beatrice Fletton. The Fletton cottage was neat but cluttered, filled with doilies and the scent of old lavender. Beatrice's mother, bedridden with a bad hip, called faintly from upstairs as Beatrice poured tea with hands that shook ever so slightly. Miss Marple declined the sugar and said conversationally, "That was a dreadful business the other night." Beatrice flinched. "Yes, I wish I hadn't gone. Seances tend to bring out peculiar reactions, spirits or not." Beatrice gave a brittle laugh. "I don't believe in any of that rubbish." "Still," Miss Marple continued, "when Miss Welborn mentioned Marianne, such an uncommon name, your glass slipped." Beatrice stiffened. "Did it?" Miss Marple smiled. "Perfectly understandable. Names can summon memories, can't they?" Beatrice hesitated. "I knew a Marianne once years ago, but it couldn't be the same." "It's just a coincidence." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Was it?" Beatrice didn't answer. She picked up the tea tray and left the room for a moment, giving herself a chance to collect whatever composure she had nearly lost. When she returned, her smile was too bright. "More tea, Miss Marple?" "No, thank you," Miss Marple said. "But thank you for the conversation. It's been most enlightening." As she stepped back into the cool air, Miss Marple glanced toward the church steeple. The bell had not rung since Portia's death. A mark of respect or a silence that held something else entirely. The pieces were coming slowly, like loose threads begging to be drawn. Miss Marple could feel the pattern emerging. Beneath the surface, shapes forming in the weave. But someone in Little Skelton was working just as diligently to pull the wool over everyone's eyes, and soon, Miss Marple thought, someone else would slip. Chapter 4. By Wednesday morning, Inspector Welch had made up his mind. "We're focusing on Harold Greaves," he said firmly, standing before a chalkboard hastily set up in the Reverend's low study. "Motive, personal dispute, unconfirmed, but likely opportunity and temperament." He tapped the word with his stub of chalk. "Volatile." Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her knitting, didn't interrupt. She rarely did in these circumstances, but she blinked slowly and watched the inspector with the faint interest of someone observing a child working out a riddle. "You see," Welch continued, "he's the only one who openly disapproved of the séance. Shouted about it in the pub that very night. In fact, Portia Welborn's death might have been a crime of passion anger, intolerance. Perhaps he confronted, or perhaps it got out of hand. But no signs of a struggle," the Reverend ventured hesitantly. Welch waved it off. "Poison can be slipped into anything, brandy, tea, or one of those powders she was always going on about. No need for a struggle." Miss Marple gently set down her knitting. "And the name Marianne?" Welch frowned. "A distraction. Could have been an invention. Portia was a showwoman. I'm not interested in ghosts. I'm interested in hard facts." "Then I fear," Miss Marple said mildly, "you may be digging in the wrong garden bed." Welch grunted but said nothing more. Outside, the village went about its usual business. But uneasily, gossip had grown teeth. By now, everyone knew Harold Greaves was the main suspect. That afternoon, Harold was seen pacing along the river path, hands in pockets, his face flushed. Later, in the post office, he snapped at poor Mr. Quibble and stormed out without buying stamps. Someone claimed he had shouted something about bloody hypocrites as he left. Mrs. Hargrave declared she had always suspected him of something unsavory, though she wasn't sure what. Even Mrs. Crowthorne, who had once flirted outrageously with Harold at a parish dance, now crossed to the other side of the street. Miss Marple, however, remained curiously unmoved. She took her tea alone that evening and laid out her notebook once more. She drew a circle in the center of the page and wrote Harold Greaves in neat block letters. Around him she listed what she had seen: loud disapproval of séance, unnerved when Marianne was mentioned, no clear personal connection to Portia, public temper yes, private motive unknown, no known access to Portia's medications. She tapped her pen once on the paper and wrote, "Visible anger often hides other emotions, but does it hide guilt or grief?" At sunset, she walked to the edge of the village where Harold's cottage overlooked the bramble fields. She found him. On the small bench outside his gate, a bottle of stout at his side and a weathered pipe in hand. "Evening, Mr. Greaves," she said pleasantly. He didn't rise, but he did tip his cap. "Evening, Miss Marple. Come to poke the angry bear?" "Certainly not. I came to check on a neighbor who seems to have been rather unfairly painted." He squinted at her. "You don't think I did it?" "I think you're a man who's lost something before," she said softly. "Your wife, wasn't it, during the influenza outbreak?" His eyes narrowed. "What's that got to do with anything?" "Only that people who've known grief often react strongly to falsehood. And I wonder whether something Portia said reminded you of someone you've tried not to remember." He said nothing for a long while. Then, looking down at the pipe in his hands, he spoke quietly. "Marianne was my sister," he said finally. "Died when she was 17. Fell down the well behind the farm. Everyone said it was an accident, but she never went near that well, hated it. And you never mentioned this?" "No one's business," he muttered. "It was 40 years ago. Marianne's name brought it all back, that's all. I don't even know how Portia could have known it." Miss Marple nodded gently. "That may be the most telling part of all." As she turned to leave, Harold called out, "I didn't like her, that's true, but I wouldn't have harmed her. Strange woman, but no one deserves that." "I quite agree," Miss Marple said over her shoulder. The following day brought a surprise. Dorothea Crane arrived at the vicarage with trembling hands and asked to speak privately with the inspector. When she emerged 15 minutes later, the news spread like wildfire. Dorothea claimed she had seen Harold place something in Portia's teacup just before the séance began. "She was standing behind the curtain," said Mrs. Crowthorne to half the village outside the butcher's. "Saw it clear as day, but she was frightened. Sod, she didn't want to get involved." "Didn't want to get involved," muttered Mrs. Hargrave, "until she had no choice." Miss Marple said nothing at first, but she did stop by the vicarage again that afternoon, this time to speak to Reverend Bartram. "Dorothea Crane is not a liar," she said gently. The Reverend blinked. "Then what do you suppose, Miss Marple?" "I think," she said, "Dorothea saw something, but not what she claims. People often mistake a gesture in a moment of tension, and if one is already frightened, the mind fills in the gaps." "You believe she was coached?" "I believe she may have been misled," Miss Marple replied. "Or perhaps she remembered something convenient rather than something true." That evening, as Miss Marple watched the mist return to the hedge, she reflected on the convenient nature of memory. Everyone seemed eager for the crime to be simple. A man with a temper, a woman with spiritual fancies, an argument, poison, done. But Miss Marple knew from long experience that the truth often wore less obvious clothing. She sat at her writing desk and opened her notebook again. She drew a second circle, this time Dorothea Crane. Beneath it she wrote, "Claims to have seen Harold tamper with teacup, previously calm. Why the shift now? Declined tea from Mrs. Trott day after death. Posted a letter next morning. To whom? Shoes, damp solace, garden, water, hidden errand. No visible emotion during séance, but reaction to name Marianne." Another line was scribbled with more urgency. "Dorothea's husband silent throughout. Travels frequently. Why so invisible?" Then a final note for the night. Marianne's name meant something to more than one person, Harold reacted. So did Beatrice. So did Dorothea. Miss Marple closed the book. The inspector might be charging down the path toward Harold Greaves with all the energy of a foxhound on scent. But Miss Marple, with her soft hands and slow step, was moving steadily toward a different kind of answer. The sort of answer that doesn't bark but rustles, that creeps in quiet places, that waits beneath words left unsaid. And somewhere in Little Skelton that answer was about to be disturbed. Chapter 5. Rain came softly that Thursday morning. A light misting drizzle that blurred the hedge and gave the streets of Little Skelton a silvery sheen. Miss Marple, having polished off her porridge and seen to her canary, fetched her mackintosh, an umbrella, and set out with deliberate calm. She wasn't headed anywhere in particular, that was the trick, really. Appear as though you're not looking, and you'll find far more than if you appear to be searching. She wandered first to the churchyard, then through the lane by the grocer's, and finally, as though remembering it last minute, down the back path to Fern Hollow. The house had been locked since Portia's death, but Elise, still in the village, and still frightened, had agreed to meet her by the garden gate. She said she kept everything tidy. Elise whispered as she passed Miss Marple a small brass key. But that last day she was restless, moved things around, left her brooch out on the writing desk, which she never did. And I found this. From her coat pocket, Elise produced a folded paper napkin. Inside it was a button black, flat, and ordinary, except for a curious silver notch along its edge. Where was it? Miss Marple asked. Under the dresser, Elise said, in her room. I thought it belonged to one of my cardigans, but I checked. It's not mine. Miss Marple turned the button over in her gloved hand. It doesn't match anything. Portia wore during the séance, she said softly. And she wouldn't have gone crawling under the furniture, but someone might have dropped it. Or someone might have knelt. Kneeling, Elise's voice was nearly a whisper. Perhaps to add something to a teacup, Miss Marple said gently. Or remove something from the room. Miss Marple thanked the girl and slipped the button into her handbag. With Elise's key in hand and no one watching, she let herself into Fern Hollow. The house was cool and undisturbed. The scent of incense still clung faintly to the drapes. She moved through the drawing room slowly, eyes flicking over the placement of chairs, the angle of the drapery, the candles that had burned low, leaving waxy petals on the black velvet table. It was in the writing room, Portia's study really, that Miss Marple paused. On the desk lay a single sheet of cream-colored paper, half-tucked beneath a leather blotter. It wasn't a letter, not quite. More like a list. Miss Marple tilted her head. Names, dates, notes. She read Marianne Greaves, 1886, accident or no. Dorothea Crane, correspondence from Marrakesh. Check dates. Lionel Kent, revisions discussed privately. Emmeline Sneed, husband's heart attack. Unusual. Check Dr. Penrose's timeline. Beatrice, mother's financial dependence. A chill passed through her. Portia had been compiling something, a private investigation not of spirits but of secrets. She glanced again at the button in her handbag, then looked toward the fireplace. Something wasn't quite right. The rug, a thick Persian carpet normally straight and symmetrical, had been shifted barely, but enough that the corner curled where it shouldn't. Miss Marple knelt, ignoring the ache in her knees, and tugged it back. Beneath the rug, hidden along the floorboard seam, lay a small brown vial empty. Miss Marple stood slowly, brushing her skirt. Her expression was unreadable. The vial matched nothing in the medicine cabinet upstairs, no valerian. Nothing Elise would have touched, and it was hidden too carefully to be merely forgotten. She locked up again without being seen and returned directly home. That afternoon, she requested a visit with Inspector Welch. "Two things, Inspector," she said, settling in his office at the vicarage. "First, I found an item you might wish to analyze for traces of any unusual substance." She handed him the small brown vial. He raised his eyebrows. "Where did you find this?" "In the fireplace," she said truthfully, if not fully, "concealed beneath the rug. Not something one finds lying about by accident, wouldn't you say?" "And the second?" "This," she said, placing Portia's list gently in front of him. Welch read it once, then again. His face shifted. "She had dirt on everyone," he muttered. "She had interest in everyone," Miss Marple corrected him. "There's a distinction. Some of these notations suggest she was watching for patterns, inconsistencies. Not gossip, Inspector, curiosity." Welch sat back. "So, someone killed her to keep her from sharing what she knew or what she might have known. And that, Miss Marple added, is a far more dangerous threat." Welch tapped the list with a finger. "This changes things. Harold may have had an emotional reaction to that name, but he wouldn't have known Portia was collecting details about the others. He doesn't move in those circles." "Exactly." Later that evening, Miss Marple sat with her embroidery, listening as the wind picked up outside. Her mind moved not with speculation, but with confirmation. She had seen the cracks. The button had opened the first door. The list had opened the second. And now, a question echoed at the edge of her thoughts. Who knew Portia's habits well? Enough to move quietly through her room, perhaps during the séance itself, and retrieve or plant something unnoticed. She thought again of Dorothea, of her sudden testimony, of the damp solace on her shoes the morning after the séance, of the letter posted in haste. Then she thought of Lionel Kent. He'd had access to Portia's legal matters, her will, her money. He knew where things were kept. And yet, he'd seemed oddly anxious that morning, not after the death, but before anyone knew it was suspicious. Miss Marple retrieved her notebook once more and drew a symbol, a circle within a square. It represented Fern Hollow. In the circle, she listed only 2 names. Dorothea saw something she didn't understand or misunderstood entirely. Lionel knowledge of will, evasive, overly precise, avoids emotional questions. Then, underneath in her fine looping hand, button too ordinary for Portia, too feminine for Greaves. Matches Kent's overcoat, must check. Vial, not Elise's, not from cabinet, could have come from Kent's own satchel. Legal men carry more than pens. The village would sleep uneasily. That night, lulled into the belief that Harold Greaves was at the center of the storm. But Miss Marple knew storms often swirled outward from much quieter places, and someone, somewhere, had dropped a button carelessly, thoughtlessly, in haste, a mistake so small, so ordinary, that no one else had even seen it, but Miss Marple had. Chapter 6. By Friday, the mood in Little Skelton had turned brittle. The village was no longer merely whispering about Portia Welburn's death. It had begun to calcify opinions into something resembling certainty. Unfortunately, those certainties shifted with each passing conversation. At the grocer's, Harold Greaves was still eyed with quiet suspicion, though the force of the gossip had begun to scatter. The arrival of the list Miss Marple had found, quietly shared by Inspector Welch with only a few key figures, had complicated things. Why would she keep a list like that? Muttered Mrs. Hargrave over her apples. Like some kind of spy? She was a spiritualist, said Mr. Quibble, frowning. They take notes? It's all about reading people? No, said Lavinia Crowthorne with sudden clarity. Portia wasn't reading them. She was recording them. The implication was clear. Portia had secrets, and more importantly, she had other secrets. Secrets Miss Marple knew were Little Skelton's true currency. Later that morning, Miss Marple received an unexpected visit from Beatrice Fletton. The girl was paler than usual, her hands nervously twisting the strap of her handbag. She declined tea but accepted a ginger biscuit, nibbling it with the delicate anxiety of someone unsure whether to eat or weep. I needed to ask you. Something, Beatrice said finally, her voice tentative. About Portia. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. Go on, dear. She said something to me the week before the séance about inheritance. Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. Did she? Beatrice hesitated. She said jokingly, I thought that people often pretended to be someone they weren't when money was involved. Then she looked at me and said, your mother's been cleverer than most. I didn't understand what she meant. Did your mother know Portia well? No, Beatrice said, flushing. But she's been short of money, and Portia was wealthy, I suppose. I wondered. She trailed off. The implication hung unspoken. Miss Marple, however, had already begun to form a shape in her mind. Did your mother know Mr. Kent? Beatrice hesitated. They used to attend the same charity committee years ago, before her hip made outings difficult. Miss Marple nodded. I wonder, dear, if your mother might have sought assistance in ways you weren't aware of. Beatrice said nothing, but her trembling hand reached instinctively for another biscuit. Later, as Miss Marple walked toward the green, she found Inspector Welch pacing with a familiar, furrowed brow. Dorothea's recanting, he grumbled. She might have been mistaken about what she saw Harold doing with the teacup. Says it all happened so quickly. Fear can tangle the memory, Miss Marple said gently. Or guilt can, Welch snapped, then sighed. We've spoken with Kent again. He said he hadn't seen Portia the week before she died, but now we've Got Elise saying she brought him in through the back door that very Monday. Ah, Miss Marple murmured. The back door? That's always where the real stories happen. Still, no sign of the missing bottle, Welch continued. Lab confirms residue in the vial you brought contained powdered belladonna. Lethal in high doses. Not valerian at all, Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Then Portia was murdered and someone took great care to disguise it. More than care, Welch said darkly. Premeditation. Miss Marple looked out over the green. Did you ask Kent why he visited Portia that day? He claimed it was to advise her on tax filings. Said nothing unusual occurred. Did he admit to knowing about the change in her will? He denies. It claims he never saw the revised draft. Miss Marple pursed her lips. How convenient. That afternoon brought a second visitor, this time to her cottage. Emmeline Sneed arrived without warning, clutching a shawl and a small velvet pouch. I can't keep it anymore, she said, pressing the pouch into Miss Marple's hand. I should have said something. I was afraid. Miss Marple opened it slowly. Inside was a locket gold, worn at the edges. Inside was a photograph of a man and a woman, Portia and someone vaguely familiar. That was my husband, Emmeline said softly. Cornelius. Miss Marple's eyes met hers. I thought he passed of a heart attack last spring. He did, Emmeline whispered, but it wasn't natural. Portia knew. She sent me this locket before she died. Said I should prepare myself for unpleasant truths. That's how she put it. I think she suspected me. Miss Marple set the locket on the tea tray. Did you give Cornelius belladonna? No, Emmeline said, barely audible. But I think someone else did. Someone who wanted him and Portia gone. Someone who profited from both deaths. Emmeline looked away. Cornelius handled Kent's financial affairs. There were irregularities, but he never acted. He said Lionel was useful. And Portia, she told him she was revising her will. Said she'd left something to me. She thought I'd earned it. She said Cornelius was furious. He thought she owed him. Miss Marple folded her hands. Did he ever tell you what Portia knew about him? No, Emmeline replied. But I think Kent might have, or used it. That night, Miss Marple reviewed her notes once more. She added a new section. Cornelius Sneed, sudden death in spring. Portia's locket sent to Emily, implied knowledge. Kent equals common link. Access to Portia's legal affairs and Sneed's accounts. Portia amended will. Kent claimed ignorance. Elise confirmed secret meeting. Kent equals pressure point. New secrets possibly feared exposure. She stared at one phrase. Someone profited from both deaths. Both deaths. Chapter 7. The next morning, the sun fought to pierce a thick mist, turning the trees around Little Skelton into pale, ghost-like shapes. It was the sort of dawn when the village stirred unwillingly, uncertain whether to trust the light or sink back into fog. Miss Marple was setting out her tea when a knock rattled her door. Not the courteous tap of a neighbor, but a sharp, insistent pounding that startled her canary into sudden flight. Inspector Welch stood outside, flushed and stern. I need you at Fern Hollow, Miss Marple. There's been another incident. Within 10 minutes, she was once again inside the ivy-clad house. The parlor had been stripped of its seance props. A constable stationed at the open window, his notebook spotted with drizzle. Welch led her into the study, where Elise sat trembling. On a floral settee, her face utterly drained. There's been a break-in, Welch muttered, during the night. No sign of forced entry, yet Elise insists the doors were locked. I did lock them, the girl whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. I always check twice. Miss Marple lowered herself beside her. What was taken? Elise swallowed. Not money, not jewels, only a folder from the writing desk, the one she always kept locked. The notes? Miss Marple asked quietly. Elise nodded. And the second will? Welch scowled, pacing. We've been looking for it. Kent swore it was never finalized. But if Portia kept a draft, Miss Marple folded her hands, then someone knew exactly where to find it. Knew Elise was staying with the Cranstons. Last night, knew the house would be empty, and took nothing but the folder. Not even the silver candlesticks, Welch muttered. Miss Marple rose, her eyes lingering on the narrow gap in the window. The latch bore no scratches. The flower bed beneath lay untouched. A practiced hand, she murmured, or a key. Welch turned to Elise. You're certain? I heard a sound, that's why I came early. I found the drawer open. The folder gone? Miss Marple studied the mystic garden. Her tone was thoughtful. Might I speak with Lionel Kent? Welch frowned sharply. You think I think, she said gently. A solicitor who insists no second will exist may have every reason to see it never does. Kent's office, a neat red brick building at the edge of the square, carried the faint smell of ink and polish. He greeted her with his usual courteous reserve. Miss Marple, how may I assist you? She smiled, pleasantly. A small clarification about Mrs. Welburn's revised will. His eyes flickered. As I've told the inspector, no such document ever reached my desk. No, she said softly, but it was discussed on the Monday before her death. Elise remembers admitting you by the back entrance. A twitch crossed his face. She must be mistaken. I think not, Miss Marple replied. I believe Mrs. Welburn entrusted you with a draft one she meant to formalize. A draft that changed her beneficiaries. I don't see. The relevance, Miss Marple murmured, is that Portia died 2 days later, and the only paper that could challenge the official record has since disappeared. Kent leaned back, fingers steepled. Even if such a document existed, and I don't concede it might not have carried legal weight, but it would have shown motive, she said, her tone still mild. If, for instance, you were among those who lost in the second version. He stared at her, then allowed himself a thin smile. Quite the tale, Miss Marple. She inclined her head, then left him in his tidy office. Back at her cottage, she reviewed her notes. The suspects no longer spun in confusion. The threads began to converge, the button, the missing vial. The secret meeting, the break-in, all pointed one way, and yet something was still missing. That evening, as the rain lashed harder against her windows, Dorothea Crane arrived. She was anxious again, her composure frayed. I'm worried about Martin, she blurted. He's changed. In what way? He's restless, short-tempered. He told me to keep out of the investigation, that I'd already made things worse. Miss Marple poured tea with quiet care. You were frightened, Dorothea. There's no shame in that. Dorothea shook her head fiercely. But I didn't imagine it. I saw something during the séance, not Harold. A man leaning forward. I thought it might have been Martin, but I couldn't believe. She trailed off, eyes wide. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on hers. Often what we refuse to believe is precisely what we must consider. I don't know what to do. Trust your instincts, Miss Marple said quietly, and trust that truth will rise, especially when someone works so hard to bury. When Dorothea left, Miss Marple sat in silence. The pieces were nearly aligned, but a new question stirred. Had Martin Crane known about the second will? His anger, his attempts to silence Dorothea, his unexplained absence on the night of the break-in. The next morning, the constable arrived with a folded letter, delivered anonymously. We thought you should see it. No signature. Neat block letters. There is something buried behind the well at Fern Hollow. Ask Elise. Ask her what she saw that morning. Miss Marple read it once, then rose to fetch her coat. Chapter 8, the morning after the letter, Miss Marple returned to Fern Hollow with her purpose stitched tighter than any of her embroidery threads. The air was sharp, the ground damp beneath her sensible boots. At the far end of the garden, past withered hydrangeas and beneath a leaning iron trellis, stood the old well sealed by a rusted grate half smothered in ivy. The very well Portia had spoken of during the séance. A gate, a child crying, something buried. Now Miss Marple stood before it, eyes narrowing at the soil beyond. Elise arrived soon after, cardigan clutched tightly about her. You wanted to see the garden? Miss Marple nodded. You came here early the morning after Mrs. Welburn's death, didn't you? Yes, I hadn't slept. I thought I heard something in the night. You came by the back way? She nodded again. Through the hedge behind the vicarage. Did you notice anything unusual? Elise hesitated. Footprints. Someone had passed through the beds, and something half buried. Go on, Miss Marple urged gently. A scarf, Elise whispered. Sticking out of the soil. I thought an animal had dragged it up. I hid it behind the shed. Miss Marple smiled faintly. You've been very brave. Show me. From behind the shed, Elise retrieved a small oilcloth bundle. Inside lay a silk scarf, pale blue, faintly perfumed, stained with soil and a darker mark, rust or dried blood. Along the hem was a stitched name tag. Crane. Miss Marple folded it carefully. This may be exactly what we need. Crouched by the well, she looked up as Welch and Constable Sims arrived. They found Martin Crane standing by the trellis, his coat muddy, his hands trembling. I was looking for my scarf, he said coolly. Dorothea said it had gone missing. In the dark? Welch asked. It must have meant a great deal. Miss Marple, observing from the path, said quietly, and such haste to recover it. Curious, isn't it? Martin's gaze flashed. Am I under arrest? Not yet, Welch said, but we'd like you to come to the station. Miss Marple turned toward the gate, her expression unreadable. The trap had sprung, but she knew this was not yet the full truth. For murder rarely begins with rage, it begins with fear. And Martin Crane, for all his composure, had just betrayed his. Chapter 9. Martin Crane sat across from Inspector Welch in the vicarage study. His brow furrowed and his damp coat steamed faintly in the warmth of the coal fire. Outside, the rain had returned steady, unyielding, and oddly fitting. It made little Skelton feel as though it had stopped breathing. Miss Marple stood at the fireplace, her shawl neatly folded over her arm, her expression calm yet sharp as pins. We'd like you to explain, Welch said bluntly, why you were in the Fern Hollow garden last night, muddy and alone, retrieving a scarf you never reported missing. Martin leaned back. I told you, Dorothea mentioned the scarf. I thought I'd check. You thought to visit a sealed estate in the middle of the night? Miss Marple asked mildly. How considerate, he said nothing. Welch leaned forward. We also have a scarf, Mr. Crane. One unearthed, stained, soiled, stitched with your name, hidden just behind the well. Martin's jaw tightened. Planted. Then you won't object if we compare it with your wardrobe? Miss Marple asked. He looked away. I must admit, she continued, that I wondered at first whether it was you or Lionel Kent, but then I recalled something Portia said. Welch blinked. You never mentioned Portia said anything important. She didn't at the time, not directly, but it came back to me. During the séance, she spoke of a rusted gate and a woman buried in the garden. At first, I dismissed it as theatrical, but Portia was never as fanciful as she pretended, Martin scoffed. You're accusing me based on séance ramblings. No, Miss Marple said. I'm accusing you on the basis of behavior, timelines, and fear. She turned to Welch. Let us begin, shall we? Welch gestured. Go ahead. Miss Marple stepped toward the center of the room. Portia Welburn came to Little Skelton not to perform seances, but to observe. She was, in her own way, an investigator. Her notes prove as much. She gathered information on various villagers, including Lionel Kent and Emmeline Sneed's late husband, but most telling of all was her close attention to the Cranes. Dorothea, seated in the corner, swallowed audibly. Martin Crane had known Portia before, not intimately, but professionally. Years ago, he was involved in an investment that collapsed, a firm entangled in misappropriated funds. Portia, I suspect, recognized him from that. She began watching him quietly. Her notes mention Marrakesh, where the Cranes had lived, and letters Dorothea sent that never reached their recipients. Martin stood. This is nonsense. Miss Marple raised a hand. Please, Mr. Crane, allow me. He sat slowly. She also revised her will. According to Elise and Emmeline Sneed, she intended to remove Kent as her solicitor and designate a new beneficiary, one we now believe was Emmeline herself. She confided this to a handful of people, and that is where the danger began. She turned toward Welch. Inspector, the poisoned valerian bottle was hidden cleverly, but only after the fact. Someone entered the room during or just after the seance and added it to the scene. We now know the bottle contained belladonna, not valerian. Elise confirmed Portia did not measure her dose that evening, as she usually did. It had already been tampered with. And who had access? Welch asked. Miss Marple turned. Martin Crane. He slipped away during the seance, perhaps during a dramatic moment, as everyone's eyes were closed or half closed. He placed the altered powder in Portia's teacup, or perhaps already had, then replaced the original vial later to maintain the illusion of a natural death. Martin snorted. You can't prove any of that. No, Miss Marple said calmly, but you attempted to retrieve the scarf. A small, careless mistake. You see, Martin, you wore that scarf the night of the seance? The same one Elise found, buried, clumsily behind the garden well. A telltale token of your rushed concealment. Had you left it where it was, it might never have been noticed. But fear, Mr. Crane, is a powerful motivator, especially for men like you, controlled, tidy, calculating. The idea of a trace left behind was too much to bear. Welch leaned forward. And the break-in? The second will? Miss Marple nodded. Also, Martin Dorothea was away that night. The house stood empty. He knew where the draft was kept. He'd heard Portia mention it to Kent, perhaps even seen it himself, and he destroyed it. Martin rose again, his voice tight. You're building a fantasy from scraps. You've no confession, no proof. Miss Marple met his eyes. But you will confess. Mr. Crane, because Dorothea has already started to doubt you, and fear, as I've said, is contagious. All eyes turned to Dorothea. She looked at Martin. Truly looked at him for the first time. You told me Portia was dangerous, she said quietly. That she would ruin us, but she only ever tried to help people. Dorothea, she stood, you said we couldn't go back to Marrakesh, that it wasn't safe, that we were followed, but it wasn't that you were hiding. Martin's mouth opened, then closed. His hands clenched. I was trying to protect us, he said hoarsely. Everything we've built, everything I rebuilt, she threatened to unravel? For what? Dorothea asked. Some scrap of morality. You killed her, Dorothea said. Didn't you? Martin looked around the room. His face was blank. Then slowly, he nodded. I didn't mean to at first, he murmured. But when she mentioned the will and Emmeline, I knew she'd already written me out. I had nothing left to lose, and she was going to expose me. He looked at Miss Marple. How did you know it was me? She stepped closer. Because you tried too hard not to be seen, and only guilty men fear attention before questions are even asked. Chapter 10. The confession had quieted the room. Martin Crane sat hunched on the edge of the vicarage study chair, no longer defensive, just resigned. Dorothea stood by the window, arms crossed, her eyes red but unreadable. Inspector Welch had made no move yet, only watched stone-faced and Miss Marple. Seated calmly by the fireplace, gave the smallest of nods before speaking. I believe it's time, she said gently, to make everything plain. Welch cleared his throat. Please, Miss Marple, let's hear it straight through. She folded her hands neatly on her lap, her tone soft and deliberate. The key to understanding. This case wasn't the murder itself. It was the behavior before and after it. That is where the truth resided, not in the teacups or the seance theatrics, but in the choices made under pressure. She turned slightly toward Dorothea, not unkindly. Portia Welburn's death appeared natural. A peaceful-looking woman, found in her bed no overt violence. But even in that moment, there were inconsistencies. Her regular dose of valerian was unmeasured. The bottle was missing, later replaced an act not of panic, but of planning. The vial Elise found in the fireplace proved the powder was not valerian at all, but belladonna, Welch nodded. Poisoning by someone who understood her habits. Precisely, said Miss Marple, and someone who had enough proximity and nerve to carry it out unnoticed during the seance, no less, when attention was scattered and eyes were closed. That narrowed the field immediately. She turned toward Martin, though her voice remained gentle. You were familiar with the layout. Oh, Fern Hollow. you used your role as a passive observer to slip away, and your composure afterward, too smooth, too distant, stood out. You inserted yourself just enough without revealing your hand. Martin said nothing. He simply watched the floor. But the real trail, Miss Marple continued, emerged through a pattern of silences. You never expressed outrage when suspicion fell on Harold Greaves. You never asked who might benefit from the change in Portia's will. You never reacted to the discovery of her notes. She turned to Welch. You'll recall Mr. Crane's alibi, the supposed restlessness during the night of the murder. His walks, his evasiveness when asked about Portia's revised legal arrangements. He denied everything, Welch muttered. And yet, Miss Marple went on, we know Elise saw Kent enter Fern Hollow secretly on Monday. Portia likely told him about the will and her suspicions of Martin. Kent, however flawed, did not act, but Martin did. Why not Kent? Welch asked. He had motive. He did, Miss Marple said, but he is a man of calculation, not risk. Kent's behavior revealed guilt of omission, not of action. He removed himself from the affair, hoping the matter would blow over or that Portia would lose interest. But Martin Crane is different. He feared not just loss of inheritance, but exposure. His past in Marrakesh, his fraudulent financial dealings, and possibly his role in the suspicious death of Cornelius Sneedall would have come to light. A stir from Dorothea. She swallowed hard but said nothing. Portia may not have had evidence, Miss Marple continued, but she had enough suspicion to frighten him. When she began implying she would change her will to name someone else, perhaps Emmeline Sneed or even Dorothea Martin acted. And he did so efficiently. The scarf, Welch murmured. Miss Marple nodded, a telling mistake. He dropped it behind the well during his hasty cleanup after retrieving or destroying the revised will. He later tried to recover it, but by then Elise had already spotted something half-buried. The anonymous letter Miss Marple received was likely from someone who saw him that morning or suspected the truth and feared it would go unnoticed. Dorothea? Welch asked, but she shook her head. No, I didn't write anything. I only saw how frightened he'd become. Miss Marple's voice softened. And fear, as we've said, is revealing. It draws out truths more effectively than confrontation. She turned back to Martin. Even your attempt to cast suspicion on Harold via Dorothea's false memory was rooted in that fear. You nudged her subtly, urged her to remember what she hadn't seen, but guilt cannot hide forever. Not in Little Skelton? A long silence settled over the room. At last, Martin spoke. She was going to ruin everything, he muttered. Not just the inheritance, the past. Dorothea and I rebuilt our lives after Marrakesh. We escaped, and Portia was dragging us back into it. You had a choice, Dorothea said quietly, her voice steady now. You always had a choice. He didn't respond. Welch stood. Martin Crane, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Portia Welburn. You'll be charged formally once we've submitted the evidence. Do you understand? Martin rose, nodded once, and allowed himself to be let out. The door closed behind him. Dorothea remained by the window, unmoving. Miss Marple rose and approached her gently. Would you like a cup of tea, my dear? Dorothea gave a faint, weary smile. Yes, I think I would. They crossed into the vicarage kitchen. The kettle had just begun to whistle. Chapter 11. The village of Little Skelton did not erupt into scandal after Martin Crane's arrest. It recoiled. People moved a little more quietly, spoke a little more softly. No one said his name aloud, not even in the butcher's queue or behind closed curtains. A veil had fallen over the lanes and hedgerows. A silent pact, that tragedy. When it occurred so close, must not be prodded. The official proceedings came swiftly. Martin offered no defense. His confession, witnessed and signed, was enough. Inspector Welsh traveled to Heathmere with a complete file of evidence. The scarf, the remnants of the destroyed, were recovered from the fireplace. The forensic results from the belladonna vial neatly catalogued. The authorities had what they needed. But justice, Miss Marple knew, rarely ended with a trial. It lingered in echoes and glances and altered morning routines. Dorothea Crane moved out of the cottage within a week. She said little to anyone. Miss Marple saw her once, standing at the train station with a small trunk and a single hat box. They exchanged no words, only a long look and a gentle nod. Beatrice Fletton, once pale and quiet, had become more withdrawn. She visited her mother daily but was rarely seen elsewhere. Rumor had it she'd written to an aunt in Devon for an extended stay. Lionel Kent, though legally unscathed, suffered his own quiet punishment. Clients withdrew. Politely but firmly, his brass nameplate lost its shine. The scandal had brushed against him too closely, and in a village like Little Skelton, proximity was guilt enough. As for Emmeline Sneed, she remained tucked behind her curtains. No longer feared, no longer whispered about, but never fully trusted either. Too many secrets had swirled through her late husband's affairs. Too many shadows remained. One afternoon, Lavinia Crowthorne came to tea with Miss Marple and spoke what many had been thinking. "It's odd," she said, dabbing her lips. "How things almost feel unchanged. The same hedges, the same vicar's sermons, the same gooseberry jam at Mrs. Hargrave's, and yet there's something underneath." Miss Marple said quietly, "Lavinia, like the village is holding its breath." "It is," Miss Marple said, "because truth unsettles more than a lie ever could." Lavinia studied her for a moment. "You knew it all along, didn't you?" "I suspected," Miss Marple replied, "but I needed Martin to reveal himself. The more clever the killer, the more invisible their guilt, but fear always gives them away." In health, Lavinia sipped her tea. "I do hope it ends with peace." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "It ends with understanding. That's quite different." That evening, Miss Marple sat in her armchair beside the hearth, her knitting idle in her lap. She thought not of justice, but of consequence, not of the bold act, but of its quiet ripples. Portia Welburn had come to Little Skelton as a stranger. She had peeled back the village's facade, seen what lay beneath, and paid for that insight with her life. And yet, in her strange and theatrical way, she had left a trail of truth behind her through notes, through gestures, through one final séance that said more than anyone had realized. Miss Marple recalled Portia's voice. "There's a gate, something buried, a name that brings shadows," and so it had. The next morning, Miss Marple received a letter. It was unadorned, unsigned. The handwriting, however, was unmistakably Dorothea Crane's. "Dear Miss Marple, thank you for seeing what I could not or would not. I'm not sure where I'm going yet, but I know it's away from all this. Perhaps that's cowardly. Or perhaps it's the first brave thing I've ever done. Please keep the book I left in your porch. Portia gave it to me years ago. I think it was meant for you." With quiet gratitude, Miss Marple stepped out to the porch and found a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a copy of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Between its pages lay a pressed gardenia and a single sheet of cream stationery. In Portia's hand, the past is patient, but it never forgets. For those who see clearly, the truth is always present. You see more than most, dear Miss Marple. Chapter 12. The wind had changed in Little Skelton. It no longer carried the faint, lingering tension that had hovered since the night of the séance. Instead, there was a silence of acceptance, a hush that came after the last bell tolls, when there's nothing left to say, but everything still to feel. A week had passed since Martin Crane's arrest, and already the village had begun adjusting. Conversations shifted gently back toward harvest suppers, vicarage rotas, and the possibility of a harsh winter. But beneath these familiar rhythms lay the shape of something no one would name aloud. In her sitting room, Miss Marple sipped her tea and opened the envelope that had arrived from Heathmere Crown Court that morning. Inspector Welch had written, as promised, enclosing the official confirmation of Martin Crane's signed confession, as well as a summary of the findings. She read the evidence provided, including the scarf retrieved near the well, the laboratory confirmation of belladonna in the residue of the decoy vial, and the destruction of the revised will corroborated by Mr. Crane's full confession, signed before 2 witnesses. He had pled guilty to the murder of Portia Welburn and was to be remanded in custody pending sentencing. The matter of Cornelius Sneed's death had been reopened for investigation. A second note, handwritten in Welch's firm script, followed. Miss Marple, I should very much like to know how you saw it all before I did. Gratefully I will, she smiled faintly and tucked the letter into the side of her writing desk. There was no pride in being right, only responsibility. She had done what needed doing. That was all. Later that day, as clouds gathered once more over the edge of the hills, Elise came to visit. She looked more at ease now. The tight line of worry across her forehead softened. "They've let me stay on at the vicarage until I find another post," she said. "The Reverend's wife is teaching me to keep accounts?" Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "You're clever, Elise. You'll make something for yourself, I'm sure." Elise hesitated, then reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded letter. "I didn't know if I should give this to you before," she said. "I found it in the hidden folder, the one Portia kept in her writing desk. I think it was meant for you." Miss Marple unfolded the letter carefully. "My dear Miss Marple, if you're reading this, it means I've either succeeded in making a difference or I've paid the price for trying. Either way, I suspect the truth has been uncovered. And if it has, I owe it to your eyes, which see so very much beneath the surface. I came to Little Skelton not just for peace, but for reckoning. I had questions about Martin and Dorothea, and about others as well. Perhaps I meddled too much. Perhaps it was never mine to solve. But I could not look away from shadows once I saw them. If I am no longer here, please see that what I learned is not buried with me. And if possible, offer kindness to those who feared the truth. Fear is the real poison, you see. Yours in watchfulness." Portia W. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and returned it to Elise's hand. "Thank you, my dear," she said. "That's exactly what I needed." After Elise left, the rain began a steady patter that misted the windows and blurred the world outside. Miss Marple sat by the fire, the soft ticking of the mantel clock the only sound in the room. She reviewed every detail for the last time, as she always did. Portia's séance had not summoned spirits, but it had stirred truth. Each guest had carried a hidden fear. Some had left theirs behind, others had been caught by it. The scarf, the poisoned vial, the will, the missing hour during the séance, the anonymous letter that led to the garden well. Each thread had pulled. Gently, never shouting, only humming beneath the village's surface until the pattern emerged. Until Martin Crane's mask cracked, it had not been dramatic. Miss Marple had not raised her voice, nor pointed a finger. Instead, she had waited, observed, and when the fear grew too loud for Martin to contain, he had exposed himself. She had merely watched the unraveling. Now there were no more threats. Emmeline Sneed's locket had been returned to her unopened. Lionel Kent had quietly closed his practice and moved to her cousins in Wiltshire. Harold Greaves returned to his river. Walks no longer watched. Beatrice Fletton left for Devon 2 days later, her trunk strapped to the back of a mail cart. Miss Marple received no more anonymous notes, no midnight knocks, no unexpected visits. Fern Hollow stood empty once more. At dusk, she lit a single candle and placed it near the window, not out of superstition, but habit. The light, she thought, had always drawn moths, but it also offered direction, a steady beacon for anyone lost in fog. The truth had been found, and the story at last was... Thanks for watching. The end. The end.